I'm Jennifer Oberlin, KHC's Manager of Training and Development. Today I'm with Karen Quinn, KHC's Deputy General Counsel, to discuss KHC's recently released Analysis to the Impediments of Fair Housing, Our Right to Choose Where We Live. I wanted to take the opportunity to discuss this today with Karen because for every application for KHC funding, you will have to be able to explain in the application how that project relates back to KHC's analysis and to certain impediments to fair housing that the corporation has recognized. Here to talk in more detail about this is Karen Quinn. And first of all, Karen's going to start talking to us about the importance of the Fair Housing Act.
Well, the Fair Housing Act is important because it basically establishes our right to choose where we live. KHC believes that the Federal Fair Housing Act is our most important civil right. And that's because study after study has demonstrated that everything in life depends on where you live. Our health, it turns out, is as much impacted by our zip code as it is by our genetic background. Our educational opportunities, our ability to get to a job, sometimes even our ability to have a job in the first place, are all impacted by where we live.
And what exactly is the Fair Housing Statute? Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. The Fair Housing Act was passed by Congress in 1968. It basically does two things. The first is that it prohibits discrimination in housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, disability, gender, or familial status, which is another way of saying children in the household. In addition, as of 2012, it also prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender, identity, or marital status. Then the second thing that the Fair Housing Act does is that for federally funded agencies like KHC, we must all act to affirmatively further fair housing. The wording there is pretty unfortunate in that it's probably some of the most awkward legal language ever used. But what it basically means is that any federally funded agency must do everything that it can to act to eliminate discrimination in housing in the area in which it serves, which for KHC is the state of Kentucky.
And Karen, since the Fair Housing Act has been around since 1968, can you explain to our viewers why KHC is suddenly pushing fair housing now?
Well, KHC has always believed that the Fair Housing Act is our most important civil right, and because to some extent, that's because fair housing at KHC has always been personal. KHC was founded in 1972 by May Street Kidd, who was one of the first women African-American legislators to serve in the Kentucky House. Now, she was actually biracial. Her mother was black and her father was white. And she knew all too well what it was like to experience discrimination firsthand. And the reason we know that is in her autobiography, she laid it all out there and she wrote, "I've been stigmatized and penalized by both races." So what Ms. Kidd did with that discrimination that she faced is she basically performed an incredible reversal. She spent her life and her career fighting injustice and discrimination. And that's one of the reasons that she helped found KHC, so that everyone, no matter their color or economic background, would be able to have a good home. So KHC has always been about fair housing, but of late we've moved fair housing concerns to front and center. And we're doing that basically because of the present economic times. We believe that the current economy has reinforced the urgency of the goals behind the Fair Housing Act. Today, it is estimated that there are 4 million violations of the Fair Housing Act every single year. And also, at the same time, study after study is telling us that less than 50% of Americans today believe that the American dream is still obtainable. And KHC believes that those two things are linked. If you cannot freely exercise your right to choose where you live, which is the stepping stone to the American dream, then the American dream is in itself in peril. The other reason that we're moving it to front and center is that HUD is proposing a new regulation on fair housing, and that's going to require us to move fair housing concerns so that they are central planning decisions. It's unclear at this point in time what form that proposed regulation will take when it's implemented, but basically KHC believes that we need to get on board and we need to get everything in place before that regulation is actually promulgated, so that KHC and all of our partners are not going to risk a loss in funding.
Wonderful, Karen, and I'm glad to hear KHC is taking such a proactive approach. Speaking of approaches, how are we approaching fair housing differently this year in 2015?
Well, we're doing things differently in 2015 than we've done before, and that's really through our fair housing report. HUD requires that we do a fair housing study every 5 years. The one that you may or may not have seen that KHC did in 2009. So our 2009 document was a good study. It was good work. We looked at different problems in discrimination in housing, and we created a list of those problems. And then we let this document lie in a drawer. Now the problem with the document lying in a drawer is that the problems the document is trying to solve are not in the drawer, they're out in the world. So the first thing that we are doing with our new AI, which is called Our Right to Choose Where We Live, is we're taking it out of the drawer. And we've now made it a central planning document, and it will guide all of our planning and funding decisions. And that is the new AI, which, as you can tell, is very different.
So Karen, could you please explain to our viewers how the new analysis to impediments is different, and furthermore, what the purpose of this new analysis of impediments to fair housing is?
Sure. As I said, I think the main difference in it is how it's going to be used. The other thing is that the new AI looks very different. For one thing, we've changed the title. HUD requires that we use the name Analysis of Impediments, but that title doesn't really carry a whole lot of weight. People are very confused about what that title means or what it really does. So we've renamed it in order to try to approach what the Fair Housing Act is all about. So the new title is called Our Right to Choose Where We Live. Now, in deference to HUD, which still requires analysis of impediments, I've made liberal use of the colon, and the subtitle is an analysis of impediments to fair housing in Kentucky. This AI is also different in that, as you read through it, you'll notice it's written very differently. This report tells our stories. It tells the story of KHC and Main Street Kid. It talks about how the passage of the Fair Housing Act was such a struggle precisely because it was so important. And it talks about the innovative work going on in fair housing, and it features some of the work of our partners and communities across Kentucky. As for the purpose of the AI, again, it's very different because the purpose of this document, in my opinion, is advocacy. Advocacy to end discrimination in housing and finally get the Fair Housing Act implemented across Kentucky. So I really urge our partners, when they advocate for fair housing or even affordable housing, I urge them to use this document because this document makes the case for why fair housing is so important. Our sister agency, the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, they've already taken that first step in that advocacy, and they've taken this report to our legislature. They've been using this report, or at least parts of it, urging the legislature to make the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act mandatory across the state. Now that act is listed as one of the impediments to fair housing in our report. And I know that something called the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act should be uniform across the state. You would think by definition and by title, but lo, it is not. And it is only in effect in a few communities across Kentucky. And that is a problem because that act sets up protections for Kentucky tenants. And essentially, if that act were to be implemented across the state, no Kentucky renter would be able to be evicted, say, in 1 day by their landlord. So House Bill 368 works to fix that. and make the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act actually uniform. Also, that act basically protects our housing quality because it also provides that both tenants and landlords must work to protect the quality of our housing stock across Kentucky.
Wonderful. Now we're going to refer to pages within the Analysis to Impediments of Fair Housing, or Our Right to Choose Where We Live. And I would like you to share with our viewers what's the single most important way that this document will now impact agencies across Kentucky.
Okay, well here's the real takeaway. If you pull up page 12 of this report, what every agency needs to know is if you are going to be seeking funding from KHC, KHC now requires that you demonstrate that your project will help to advance fair housing goals across the state. So in order to prepare this report, KHC met with the Fair Housing Task Force. We met repeatedly, and we made a listing and a study of the different obstacles to fair housing across Kentucky. And as you look here, you will see that there are basically 25 main obstacles to preventing people in Kentucky from being able to freely exercise their right to choose where they live. And those obstacles you will find listed on pages 12 to 15. KHC has made the decision that they are going to use all the funding available to it to work to eliminate those obstacles. What this means for agencies is that if they are going to be seeking funding from KHC, they need to be familiar with that listing, and they are going to need to tell us in their application which impediment to fair housing their project will work to eliminate and how their project will do that. And agencies which do not comply with those questions on the application, then those agencies, their application will not be considered for funding.
Okay, that's very important, and we want to make sure our grantees understand that. So essentially, if you intend to apply for KHC funds, you need to become familiar with this document and certainly become familiar with the impediments that we as an organization have identified.
Right, and how they will work to either reduce or eliminate those obstacles.
Wonderful. And as you alluded to earlier in the session, the Analysis to Impediments is updated every 5 years. Could you please tell the viewers what KHC's goal is with the 2015 Analysis to Impediments and what your long-term or at least 5-year goal is with this Analysis to the Impediments?
Well, our hope with this report is this. You know, last year, as all of you know, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. But we obviously didn't celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And that's because the Fair Housing Act was not passed until 4 years after the Civil Rights Act, and that was in 1968. And the Fair Housing Act was so difficult to get passed, and it was so opposed by so many, because so much was at stake, that the Fair Housing Act only came to be passed after President Lyndon Johnson begged Congress to do so in light of the horrible assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So KHC's hope with this report is that in 2018, this approach to fair housing, this approach to our fair housing report, and our pulling together to work across the state to eliminate discrimination will mean that when we do celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, we really have something to celebrate. That we will be celebrating that we have finally and fully implemented the Fair Housing Act across Kentucky by pulling together and working together to eliminate those 25 obstacles.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen, for bringing the Analysis to Impediments, fair housing, or our right to choose where we live, to life for us grantees around the state of Kentucky.